So within superhero storytelling, a trinity isn't just a group of three characters. It's a symbolic core, a narrative foundation that represents the values, balance, and identity of an entire universe. Now we have seen this trinity ideal being used so successfully across a major universe, which is DC. They perfected this. They have Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman, just their most recognisable heroes across the DC universe. And the reason why they're so successful is because they each embody a distinct ideal: hope, strategy, and strength. And across comics, films, animations, they operate as a stable axis that everything else turns around. They base all of their major storylines across these three, and it's kind of fascinating to realise. Marvel, by contrast, had never really had that. It's had popular characters, for instance, Spider-Man, Wolverine, Captain America, Iron Man, all these major characters within all these major storylines, but no trio that consistently functions as a central unit, no agreed upon big three that defines what the Marvel Universe is at its core. Now, I gotta ask the question, why? Why has a Marvel, with all its success and character depth, they've had literally a major cinematic universe that reaped the rewards of major storylines like Infinity War, Endgame, Civil War? Why haven't they been able to establish a lasting trinity? That's what we're exploring within this video. So before we get into why hasn't Marvel established or created a new trinity within the MCU or their own comics, we have to understand why a trinity concept works so well. And I'm particularly mentioning the DC universe. So let's just go into it again. DC's trinity consists of Batman, Superman, and Wonder Woman, like I just said. But the reason why they're so important is because they function as more than a narrative device. I'd actually say it's a strategic marketing framework, each character embodying a core ideal. So, for instance, Superman represents hope, Batman embodies strategy, and Wonder Woman signifies strength and compassion that brings them together. So they form a balanced representation of the heroism ideal and concept. So this trio has been consistently positioned at the forefront of DC's storytelling, serving as the foundation for major events like Trinity War, Infinite Crisis, Death Metal, Dark Metal, all Blackest Night. It's in so many storylines across Rebirth and New 52 area. But their presence ensures thematic cohesion across the DC universe, always being the forefront of the major storylines. It is crucial to acknowledge the benefits, but also the drawbacks of this trio. Now, I'm going to particularly focus on Wonder Woman. She holds a pivotal role symbolically within the Trinity. I don't think you can do Batman and Superman together with another particular hero. I think it's like brother and sister. She brings them both together. That's what makes the Trinity so great, in my opinion. When you look at all the different issues across the Rebirth, New 52, she acts like the older sister, bringing both these two together. But her solo ventures have historically faced challenges in achieving comparable commercial success, however. So for instance, in March 2025, Absolute Wonder Woman, the new series that has been released right now, issue 6, ranks 6th in sales, trailing behind titles like Batman 158 and Absolute Superman issue 5. This trend highlights the challenges in translating Wonder Woman's iconic status in consistent commercial performance. Now, you can theorise why the commercial performance isn't as great as compared to the other titles like Batman and Superman. I like to think of it and compare different aspects of the characters. When you think about Superman and Batman, you can visually see who their rogue gallery is. So for Batman, for instance, you can see the Joker, Clayface, Penguin, Mr. Freeze, Poison Ivy. These are just coming off the top of my head. And Superman, you see Metallo, Cyborg Superman, Lex Luthor, Bizarro, Doomsday. You see all these major villains coming off the top of my head here. Well, when you compare it to Wonder Woman's rogue gallery, it lacks the widespread recognition of their counterparts. Now, for instance, I can only think of Cheetah, Ares, and probably Circe are quite notable, but they don't have the same cultural footprint as Batman's Joker or Superman's Lex Luthor. So to illustrate, consider this. Can you name off 8 of Wonder Woman's adversaries on the top of your head right now? Okay, so if you did, well done. But now try the same with Batman's foes. Like I just named off, Penguin, Riddler, Two-Face. They all come to mind instantly. This disparity underscores the challenges in establishing a compelling and memorable set of antagonists for Wonder Woman. Like The only notable storyline I actually remember of Wonder Woman's is her origin story, which is so disappointing because she's such an interesting character. Now, despite these challenges that I've just narrowed off in terms of her own poor commercial success, I do think Wonder Woman's role within the Trinity does remain crucial and pivotal. So, for instance, in the events like Dark Knight, and this is just one that I read off recently, in Dark Knight's Death Metal, she does play a central role in ultimately defeating the Batman Who Laughs. Now, I particularly remember when Themyscira was actually converted into like a prison holding cell thing, and she led her own resistance, and she forged that new lasso of truth. I can't actually remember the name of it. I think it's called the Chainsaw of Truth, where she ultimately killed the Batman Who Laughs. Those particular storylines reinforce her own significance within the DC, let's just say, narrative framework. Even if her solo ventures do face commercial hurdles, I do think in other counterparts she does become more prominent within the Trinity. I've just explained the drawbacks and benefits of Wonder Woman's role within the Trinity, but I don't really think I have to justify the reason why Batman. Now I'm going on to Batman and Superman right now. I don't think I have to justify why Batman and Superman have been successful. They have been everlasting. They have been so popular for 10, 20, 30, 40 years. I don't know how long it's been, because they've had so many different story runs. They've had so many different animated films. They've had so many different actual films. You know what I mean? They've just been everlasting. They are literally on the Mount Rushmore in terms of superheroes. They will always be there, in my opinion. That's why DC can always use those two as a main starting point, like a reset button, like the new DC universe right now. I think they will always be successful if they have those two at the forefront, with Wonder Woman connecting them together to make that lasting trinity. I want to transition onto the Marvel comics specifically, why they haven't created a lasting or a new existent trinity. So before we get into the specifics, let's just take a step back in terms of Marvel has no shortage of major characters, and I can say that. But when you break them down by popularity, then this is how I'm going to break them down. So this is going to be by popularity, symbolic role, team fit, and narrative longevity. None quite form this stable trio that you can see in the DC universe. So this chart that I'm going to present right now, this outlines this issue. You'll see that each character has strengths, but also a gap that makes them hard to lock into a defined, reoccurring trinity. And this is where Marvel runs into the problem that I think DC solved decades ago. So when trying to form a trinity within the Marvel Universe, before I was making this video, I was trying to think who were the best characters that you could actually evolve the Marvel Universe around. And to define the Trinity is the structure of the universe itself. Unlike DC, which centres its major narratives around the Justice League and that actual Trinity, Marvel operates through the multiple factions. Now, I'm going to list them off. So you get the Avengers, you have the X-Men, you have the street level heroes with Spider-Man, heroes for hire like Luke Cage, Danny Rand, Iron Fist, and Daredevil. And you have these cosmic entities out of Earth. So you have the Guardians of the Galaxy, you have Thor, you have Silver Surfer, you have all these major characters, right? But this decentralized approach offers a diverse scale, but makes it difficult to establish a cohesive trio that symbolizes the entire universe of the Marvel comics. So when evaluating Marvel's major characters, the ones most likely to be considered for a trinity, none of them quite align. Now I'm going to list these off, but each of them have their strengths, but they really operate together. And they don't offer the kind of stable narrative balance that is seen within DC. So these observations are based on character arcs, publication history, and their roles within the major storylines like Secret Invasion, Civil War, House of M, all these major storylines. Now the first character that I'm going to list off that might not be the greatest Marvel Trinity character to utilise is Spider-Man. Now I know this is a bit of a shock because he's Marvel's most iconic figure. He's probably in the Mount Rushmore in terms of superheroes. He literally embodies the theme, with great power comes great responsibility. We've all heard it. We've heard it in the Maguire, Garfield and Holland films. However, his narrative is deeply rooted in personal struggles and street level conflicts. And that's why I think makes Spider-Man so great, because he has that own individual type of behaviour. You can see within the comics, you can see within the movies, he has those struggles, but he also puts those on top with his superhero duties. Like he struggles to make rent, He struggles to secure a job in the early foundations of Spider-Man comics. He always has relationship struggles, and we always see those type of aspects, dynamics, with the Spider-Man duties. In terms of team behaviour, he has participated in teams like the Avengers, but he's often remained on the periphery and is rarely positioned as team leader. This is evident in storylines where his leadership is either short-lived or met with skepticism by peers. Now, the next key figure that I don't think is going to be in the Marvel Trinity, even though his popularity had an absolute spike within the 90s and early 2000s, is Wolverine. Wolverine is a central figure in the X-Men universe, known for his complex character and moral ambiguity. His solo series are always so popular, such as the one penned by Chris Claremont, delving into his introspective nature and the violent tendencies that he has. He has that animalistic behaviour. While he is a team member of the X-Men, he's often on the lone operative. He's usually on his own. He usually just goes to a bar and just drinks, making him less suited for that unifying Trinity role because he always has that individual type of behaviour. He always goes off and does his own thing, either fighting Sabretooth or the job's going too slow, so he has to do it by himself. This is why I don't think he might be the best Trinity role member. Now, these next three characters are going to be mentioned in the next segment later on, in terms of why I think the MCU was so successful as it was, if it wasn't just for these three. But however, I don't think these three would have been successful to be used as a trinity within the Marvel Comics. We're going to start off with Captain America. He literally embodies the ideals of leadership and moral fortitude. He's been in the forefront of major events like Civil War, serving as the moral compass between right and wrong. However, his solo comic sales have fluctuated over the years, and he often shares the spotlight with other characters. Now, this being the Falcon, or the Winter Soldier, or Agent 13, always being introduced constantly to build up that Captain America series. Now, in terms of the supervillain factions like Hydra, I always felt that they had to bring him in just to make the series interesting, and it felt a bit repetitive. But up until the Winter Soldier, where I think he might have been introduced in 2005, I thought that was the only interesting character development, let's just say, in terms for Captain America. But anyway, this inconsistency in commercial performance impacts his position as a central Trinity figure. The next character is Iron Man. Iron Man's popularity surged within the MCU, but in comics, his character is portrayed with significant flaws, including a huge arrogance and a troubled past. Story arcs like Demon in a Bottle highlight his struggles with personal demons. While he plays a crucial role in team dynamics, the inconsistent portrayal affects his stability for a stable Trinity role. The next character would be Thor. He brings the immense power and a mythological dimension to the Marvel Universe, but his narratives often revolve around Asgardian lore, making him feel a bit detached from the Earth-centric storylines. His solo comic sales have also been significant drops, indicating challenges in maintaining consistent reading engagement for a Marvel Trinity role. In summary, Marvel's diverse character roster offers a wealth of diverse storytelling opportunities, each character bringing unique strengths, but their individual narratives and roles within the Marvel Universe makes it rather difficult to establish a stable, unifying trinity.
So Marvel Comics never quite locked down that stable trinity with the characters that we just mentioned. But within the MCU, however, they almost did it by total accident. It wasn't formally announced, it wasn't branded, and it wasn't part of a long-term publishing plan. But the outcome was rather clear. For over the decade, the MCU was anchored by the three main characters that we saw throughout all the Avengers films, all their sub-solo films. And these were Cap, Iron Man and Thor, and together they gave the cinematic universe a kind of structure for Marvel Comics that they never fully grasped or quite achieved within the decades of running their own comics. So the first time that we actually see this Marvel concept Trinity idea is actually introduced in the first Avengers film, which was in 2012. Now it's not really subtle. I don't know if you guys remember, but there was a forest scene with Cap, Thor and Tony arguing over what to do with Loki. It does get a bit loud and messy and full of ego, like they're trying to beat each other up. Thor using his hammer, Iron Man taking the piss out of Thor's hair, But that's not what's important. It isn't about the action. It's about the contrast. You're watching 3 different ideologies clash in real time. Now let's get into it. So Tony's logic is quite simple. He's trying to stop the threat by any means possible. Whereas 4, he's rather raw, instinctive. He literally just pulls Loki out of the bloody ship or the Quinjet. And Cap, he's trying to mediate it. He's not trying to do it with power, but with principle. He steps in not as the strongest or the smartest. Like, he literally had a conversation with Black Widow, saying you're literally dealing with actual gods. But he's actually the one who sees the need for a team. That moment that sets the tone for everything that comes after. Now, all these are included in all different films. So from that point forward, those 3 characters quietly and subtly become the MCU's emotional and moral backbone. Not because they always agree or because their conflict creates structure. Cap represents loyalty and values. Iron Man is innovation and consequences for his actions. Like, I know in the comics it's Ant-Man that creates Ultron, but in this case it's Iron Man. And then 4 is myth and legacy. So all these different tensions between them give this MCU internal friction, let's just say, but also that cohesion. You need to watch how each of them evolved to understand where the universe was heading over that decade. And that's one of the most important things that actual Marvel Trinity offers, is that narrative tissue. So within comic terms, it's the equivalent of a shared title arc or an event book that you lead in multiple issues to a series event. You had to follow these 3 heroes to see the bigger picture. So, for example, watching Winter Soldier helped you understand Civil War, about that conflict between Tony and Cap. And then Ragnarok reframed Thor for Infinity War. And then Age of Ultron, despite its flaws, showed how cracks in Tony's and Cap's alliance led directly to their main split within Civil War. So for the first time in, let's just say, cinema, we had a franchise that worked like serialized comics, not just sequels, but interconnected storylines that shaped the outcomes of characters across all these separate films within the MCU. These 3 main characters formed the centre Marvel could build outward. Like, the Trinity became a launchpad, not just a destination, but Tony introduced Peter Parker. Cap built trust with Wanda. 4 opened the door to cosmic characters like the Guardians. None of those arcs were accidental. They worked because the audience already had an emotional foundation in place. The Trinity never gave newer characters something to orbit. Again, you see this in Civil War. The film is pitched as a team conflict, but it's really about Tony and Steve. No clear villain, no right answer, just 2 leaders with fundamentally different views that are forced into collision. That's only possible because of the groundwork built across previous films. Without this Trinity, it's literally just fluff or just noise. With a Trinity, it's character-driven stakes. And then finally, this endgame, the moment where Cap, Iron Man and Thor face Thanos together. It's not just symmetry or closure, it mirrors the forest scene from the Avengers, only this time they're not actually fighting each other, they're aligned, unified, and each take on their own separate role. Cap leads with courage, Thor delivers that power, and Tony makes the sacrifice, which Cap brought up in the first film. You won't make the final play, you won't be the last guy. The Russos even said, it began with them, it ends with them. And that wasn't just the random play in the film. It was a structured storytelling. The MCU didn't just use these characters, it used their dynamic to shape the emotional logic of the MCU. That's the value that the Trinity offers. It anchors that specific tone, balances personalities, and creates that continuity that the MCU needs. It gives the audiences something to return to, even as new stories branch out. See, DC built that into their publishing model. Now Marvel stumbled into it through film, and it proved to be so successfully. But here's the problem. That Trinity is now gone now. Tony's dead, Cap passed the shield, and Thor is kind of isolated up in the cosmic space, and his arc feels kind of directionless. The MCU has continued, but without a clear centre. Newer characters have arrived, Shang-Chi, Sam Wilson, Carol Danvers being the new, let's just say, central figure, but none of them are positioned as part of a stable trio. And with Secret Wars coming on the horizon, Marvel needs more than ever than those scattered protagonists. It just needs a new core, let's just say. Now the main question isn't whether Marvel can create a Trinity. We've seen that it can. The real question is whether it can do it intentionally, before the next phase loses what the last one built so carefully, that connective tissue. Now the MCU showed that the Trinity can work, but in Marvel Comics, that structure has never taken hold. And that's not just by coincidence. It's the result of how Marvel has always told their stories, how it prioritized teams over icons, and how its editorial direction moved away from that symbolic centrality towards something more fluid and sometimes more chaotic. So from the start, Marvel was always more interested in those relationships than legends. The first successes came from specific teams such as the Fantastic Four, the Avengers, the X-Men, and even when individual characters gained popularity like Spider-Man, they were deliberately positioned outside those groups. Peter Parker was never designed to lead any specific team. His strength as a character was always tied to that isolation, balancing heroism with responsibility and loss. That made him deeply human, connecting it to the reader, but narratively disconnected from a shared leadership model. As Marvel expanded, this team-first approach only deepened. Characters like Wolverine, Cyclops and Storm carried entire factions, but they did so as part of ensembles, and those ensembles kept multiplying, such as going into different factions, such as X-Force, Excalibur, West Coast Avengers, Midnight Suns. They were defining Marvel with a diversity and a large scale, not just a singularity team. Even when the characters had serious momentum, now I'm specifically talking about the superhero with the films, Spider-Man with the Raimi films, Hugh Jackman as Wolverine with the X-Men, Iron Man launching the MCU, those figures were never brought together in the comics as a stable core. Instead, Marvel leaned into the constant escalation, and with escalation came that inconsistency, I thought. One year Iron Man is the face of leadership with the director of S.H.I.E.L.D. The next is Cyclops, and then Steve Rogers dies in Civil War. Then Norman Osborn leads S.H.I.E.L.D., or Hammer I think. The spotlight keeps moving and the structure never settles. Constantly pushing that thread is also editorial. Marvel's built its publishing strategy around short-term impact, relaunches, new first issues, rotating those creative teams. Every time a title gains traction, it's either cancelled, rebranded, or folded into an event. There's no long-term plan. Now, I'm setting Secret Wars on the side. I don't really think that counts. But there's no long-term plan to elevate these three characters as the emotional centre of the universe. And then it's attempted, like Avengers Prime or during the Heroic Age. It never lasts. There's no editorial appetite for that kind of serious continuity. So no matter how many iconic names Marvel has, they will never form that Trinity, because the system doesn't support one. The model is flexible, not fixed, and that's why, despite decades of great characters, Marvel Comics still hasn't created a lasting central three. Now for this particular section, I want to focus on should Marvel even try to build one. Now I'm going to involve different aspects of the comics and also the films. So at this point, we've seen that Marvel can build a Trinity, within specifically the MCU. But with that original trio gone, and the comics still avoiding to build one, the question is worth asking, should Marvel even try to rebuild one? So let's just delve into the MCU. Right now, Marvel is in a difficult place. Phase 4 and 5 were meant to introduce a new generation of heroes, but the execution didn't deliver. Sam Wilson as Captain America was a smart legacy choice, but the Falcon and the Winter Soldier lacked that, let's just say, weight needed to reframe him as a long-term leader. Moon Knight was introduced also, but never meaningfully integrated. Shang-Chi showed sort of promise, but hasn't reappeared since his debut. That broader connective tissue, the thing that made the Infinity Saga work, just isn't there within Phase 4 and 5. And audiences have noticed, they have dropped off. Box office and streaming data reflected a sharp drop in engagement. Ant-Man and the Wasp opened to the 104 million domestically, now this is Quantumania, but also collapsed in the following weeks with a 70% second week drop. The Marvels grossed only 46 million in its opening weekend, one of the lowest in the MCU history. Even Thor: Love and Thunder, despite returning a core character, struggled critically and divided its audiences. These aren't just blips, they aren't just a luck of the draw. They're signs that the current model isn't connected. So if Secret Wars is supposed to be the next Endgame, now this is what everyone's saying on Twitter, social media, it's supposed to bring the old characters back and in different universes, like the old X-Men, old Spider-Man, old Ghost Rider, all these other characters. Marvel needs a new core fast, and that means re-establishing a functional Trinity, not for branding, but for the story structure. You need that emotional anchors to build arcs around, and right now, there's no clear centre. Now, a potential path is using what's already there. So 4's still alive, and 4-5 is now confirmed. If done right, it could be moved away from the tone of Love and Thunder. Now, I could arguably say that it's the same type of tone with Ragnarok. I don't know why it dropped off. Maybe it was just too cheesy and just too gimmicky. I don't know. But they could reposition him towards something more grounded, possibly building towards a version of Doomsday or God Butcher with a real consequence for 4. Pair that with the up-and-coming Fantastic Four, the literal first family of Marvel, and you've got a chance to rebuild that connective tissue. Not just to relaunch new heroes, but to stabilise that universe again, to have that connective tissue which we keep coming back to. Now the Fantastic Four are the perfect fit. Now this is historically and structurally. In the comics, they were always meant to be the link between science, family and cosmic threat. Now I think that's Marvel to its core. They don't need to be that Trinity themselves, but they can hold the universe together long enough to form one, whether that includes Doctor Strange, Sam, or even the new X-Men, which I don't know what part of the phase that's going to be in the MCU timeline. But nevertheless, the point is you need that structured before the spectacle. And so far, the post-Endgame MCU hasn't got that. Now, what about the comics? Now, that's really a different challenge itself, but it also has that opportunity. Marvel never really formed that formal Trinity within the comics, but it could build one. The groundwork's there. They could emerge through Miles Morales, Kamala Khan, or Laura Kinney. All three are popular and they carry that legacy names from Spider-Man and Wolverine, and they speak to a newer generation. They each bring different strengths. Miles with that emotional centre, Kamala with maybe optimism, and Laura with that resilience. Together they could frame that modern Marvel universe through different lens. Not really mythic, where they get that from 4, but generational, different generations. Another potential option could be 4, Strange and Hulk, possibly representing that power trio, each representing different aspects such as cosmic, mystical and physical. They've all been central to those major storylines, such as Defenders and World War Hulk. Another potential trio could be Sam, Cap, Jean, potentially T'Challa, bringing that specific leadership, compassion-esque legacy at the centre of Marvel. More philosophical than tactical, but it could ground Marvel's more human storytelling direction, especially with the X-Men returning to their prominence. There could even be an argument made that the X-Men team or era could provide that unity that Marvel needs. For decades, the X-Men functioned as their own sub-universe, as to say, and now with titles like House of X and Immortal X-Men, they've reclaimed that narrative focus with mutants set to return to screens, and they could provide that different issues, storylines for Marvel. Maybe that's where the next trio could potentially come from. Now those were just raw ideas, but let's just say for devil advocate's sake, Marvel doesn't need a Trinity at all. Maybe the chaos is part of the brand. The constant motion, the shifting of the spotlight for different characters. That ensemble format, that's always been Marvel's identity, but the goal is to give audiences another endgame moment for the MCU. Something with emotional weight and that narrative symmetry, that connective tissue that's branching different projects of Marvel all together to collide into that Secret Wars saga. Then a new Trinity might be the only way to get there. So the MCU needs to rebuild that trust. The comics need to reframe that legacy. And if Marvel wants its next era to resonate with different audiences, it might have to do what's always resisted. Choose 3 and let the rest orbit around them. So now I'm going to put the question to you. If Marvel were to rebuild a Trinity today, what would you choose? And do we even need one? Or is the chaos, that constant shift, that constant flux of characters, is that what makes Marvel Marvel? But let me know in the comments. Drop that ideal Trinity comic or MCU. Legacy picks, different wild cards, whatever works. Let's build something that Marvel never quite did.